enough time. So
Okay.
okay. Being recorded. Look at that. Facebook recorded. That was fast.
Oh, Facebook. All right. That was my next question. We don't have to worry about
it. We're up. And the chat is going too fast. And thus I need to close it as I always do, because then I will just become distracted and talk to you guys. Okay. Good morning to everyone. Welcome to History Matters. And so does a really big cup of coffee.
Cheers, everyone.
Yes, coffee is really important. So today, as advertised, we are going to be talking about public opinion, which is an important topic for a variety of reasons, which I will explain in a moment. But before I do, I will turn to someone already got bingo. I will turn to Annie, my partner in crime, bingo, who will explain the rules of the game. Bingo, before we begin. So Annie, go ahead and explain the rules of the game.
I would love to. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our beautiful History Matters and So's coffee community. I'm thrilled again this week to be with you all and Joanne. And thank you, Carol Lee, for letting us know which episode this is. We depend on you for that every week. I am the Director of Education and Outreach at New American History at the University of Richmond, and that's my shameless plug for the morning. Thank you also to NCHE for having this community available to us. If you have not been on their website, ncheteach.org, you can learn about all the wonderful programs, so much good summer programming going on this summer. And this community meets every Friday as part of that ongoing programming. We're delighted to be here with Joanne, and we would love for you to put questions in the Q&A. The chat goes way too fast, and I don't have that, I can't write that fast. So I need you all to please put your best questions in the Q&A. And I think we're just ready to go now. We're anxious to hear all about this morning's topic. I'm excited.
Excellent. People are getting bingo left and right.
I don't understand. We just started talking.
We did. For anyone who is new, there is an ongoing bingo game, because apparently I'm so predictable in what I say every week that people can get bingo based on all of the things I reliably say. So at any rate, there's a card floating around there in chat that somebody could repost if anyone else wants to play along. I'm still endlessly amused that it exists, but it does indeed mean that I'm predictable. Okay, public opinion. Now, what led me to think about this, and it's going to sort of get to a point that I'll come to at the end, which is in talking about public opinion, I'm linking to a lot of other pretty fundamental aspects of democratic governance. But what led me to this topic was a number of things that sort of passed by my eyes in some way online or something that I was reading that all seemed to lead to this. So, for example, first I thought about I think it's a Florida high school that was going to ban the yearbooks or block out a page of the yearbooks because there was a page in which a student LGBTQ don't say gay protest was in the yearbook, and the school wanted that out of the yearbook. They didn't want any of that in the yearbook. And I think, and there was like a sign that said love is love. They were like, no. So that caught my eye, not just because the school was trying to ban it, but because the students spoke up. The students expressed their opinion. I'm going to come back to this at the end. Very assertively, not rudely, but they showed up and they spoke up, and the school backed down. So I was like, okay, well, there's some opinion, a strategic part of the public, but public opinion making itself heard and having an impact. Then I thought about a comment that Clarence Thomas made, I don't think this week, maybe last week. And I didn't have time this morning to get his precise words, but essentially what he said was, the public needs to just accept Supreme Court rulings. Like, we don't have to please you. And in the past, the public has always accepted Supreme Court rulings. Now, first of all, as a historian, no, they haven't, right? And as a matter of fact, I don't think Roe v. Wade has been accepted, has it? So, that kind of statement is ridiculous. Never mind Brown v. Board of Education and all of these other moments in which, of course, Americans spoke up and expressed their opinion about Supreme Court rulings that they didn't like. Not because they assumed that if they spoke up, they would change a Supreme Court ruling, but because their opinion mattered, and offering a sense of where the public is on an issue matters even after a Supreme Court ruling. So those things together had me thinking about public opinion and why it matters and how it was being thought about in the early republic. And I've written about this before. I may have even spoken about it before. And I looked over, at this point, 110, 109 before today episodes. I was like, did I talk about public opinion? I may have, but I am going to talk about it in a different way today. So it will not be a repeat episode. But the place to start with this topic is the simple fact that the importance of public opinion in the new government, this new republic that was being created, democratic republic that was being created, public opinion was central to it. And that was one of the things that Americans generally and the political power holders specifically understood was really distinctive about what was going on in the United States. Basically, a republic, a democratic republic, grounded on representation. One of the things that made it differ from, for example, a monarchy was the degree to which public opinion mattered. Public opinion ruled. Public opinion, partly as registered in elections, partly in other ways as well, was really seen as the guiding force of a republic. They talked about it all the time. I've written about it any number of times. And in part, what has always fascinated me about it is when you think about it, it sounds concrete and it's very vague. What is public opinion? What does it mean? Now, today, we have polls and a variety of different ways in which we try to measure public opinion. And of course, they conflict with each other and we're never quite sure we know what public opinion is. But in the early republic, for the founding generation, they knew it was important. They talked about it all the time. They didn't know how to get it. They didn't know who counted as public. They knew who they didn't count as part of the public, but they didn't know, where do you go to collect public opinion and where should they be going to understand, what average Americans, meaning white men who were not particularly elite, but certainly have a lot to say, and potentially should be swinging elections based on what they want. How do you do that? How do you find them? How do you figure out who they are? And you have to, right? Because these are the people who put the government in motion and they're like, okay, public opinion. So for example, James Madison writes in the period, public opinion sets bounds to every government and is the real sovereign in every free one. So I'll say that again. Public opinion sets bounds to every government and is the real sovereign in every free government. So in the early republic, which is still sort of improvising and trying to figure out how things work and what things mean, even though they set it in motion, one of the things that they did frequently was write to each other about trying to figure out public opinion. At the same time as politicians were trying to do this, the American public, not actually just white men, but the American public generally was learning what kind of a voice they could have and how to express it in the early republic. And this is there are a lot of things going on in the 1790s. There's a reason why I love writing about that decade. But one of the things is that there's a conversation, I suppose you could say it's the conversation of democracy, where power holders are put in power by the people. Power holders are trying to figure out what the people think. The people are trying to figure out how to express what they want above and beyond their votes. So that's, there's a fundamental conversation in the 1790s about the working of a democratic government, and public opinion is smack at the center of that. So there are different sides of a political conversation kind of trying to find a way to meet in the 1790s. And as you'll hear in a moment, the Federalists had very strong views about that, views that ultimately were not in the direction of where the Republic was going. But I will come back to that shortly. You can see, and I think I believe one of these stories I might have mentioned before, but I do not believe I have quoted it. And if I have, just humor me, because this happens to me all the time in my teaching, because there are, I have a lot of stories in my brain. But some of them, when I talk about a topic, they're the first thing that leaps to the front of my brain because they're great. And after, I don't know, 25, 26, however many years I've been teaching, and even longer lecturing, I no longer have any way of knowing if I've told you the story before, but at least they're going to be good stories. So in this case, this takes place in 1790. So the government only in action for a year. And there's a South Carolina representative named William Loughton Smith, who is a Federalist. And he wants to know what the South Carolina backcountry, so not the urban population, but more average South Carolinians, what they think about what's happening in the government. He wants public opinion. So as he explains, so I found this initially, he writes about it in his diary, then he reports on what he found to Alexander Hamilton. So there's two different ways you can get at it. So he describes how he very deliberately changes his clothing and wears a very plain, modest frock coat, as opposed to what an elite gentleman would wear in this period. So he basically goes undercover as a less elite guy in this story. And he goes and wanders around and sits places to see what they have to say. And so in one tavern, he writes, the tavern goers, quote, spoke their minds freely. And he writes in his diary, like, yes, sir, they were saying what they wanted to say and they didn't know who I was. But when he returned to that tavern later that day with his wealthy elite guy jacket on, his normal clothing on, his tavern friends realized with horror that they had been expressing their opinions on Congress to a member of Congress. And Smith records in his diary the conversation, the rather anxious conversation that resulted at that moment. So according to Smith, one of the tavern goers said anxiously, we suppose, sir, from your acquaintance with the proceedings of Congress, that you probably are a member of that body, gulp. And Smith says, yes, I am. From what state? Asked another tavern goer. He says, South Carolina. Another one says, Mr. Smith, right? Mr. William Loughton Smith. Yes, sir, says Smith. Another one says, I've heard a great deal of you, sir. Had we known who you were, we would have spoken with more reserve about Congress. So that conversation must have been like, and another thing, they probably were speaking rather freely. And Smith says, it was on that account I did not discover who I was in order to hear opinions about government with freedom. So he goes undercover, gets what he wants, and these poor tavern goers are like, we don't know what we just said, but maybe it wasn't good. And he describes as well, knocking on doors of farmhouses to see what newspaper is on their mantle. If it's not the correct newspaper, meaning if it's not a Federalist newspaper, he gives them the correct paper. He looks for people walking around on the street reading the wrong newspaper and goes up to them and says, that's a rag, you should be reading this. So he's collecting public opinion, but he's also converting public opinion, which shows you how much it matters, but it's a complicated process. Another example of this, 1796, in this case, you have Massachusetts Representative Theodore Sedgwick, another Federalist, and I'm about to come back to Federalists and public opinion in a moment. He asks a friend of his to try and figure out public opinion of what he calls the yeomanry of Massachusetts, right? His friend, I believe it's Henry Van Schack. I didn't write it down here, but yes, it is Henry Van Schack. He says, go figure out what the yeomanry think about this new government. And by this point, 1796, it's been in effect for a few years, but we've changed. We're now have the Adams administration, so they probably want to know what people are thinking. So Mr. Van Schack says he'd be happy to comply. And he says, with sarcasm dripping from this statement, I am one of the people. And always when there is political matter of importance on foot, I mingle with the yeomanry in bar rooms. Okay, so the tone of that will matter more in a moment. So he goes and he hangs out with the yeomanry in bar rooms and he reports his findings for well over a year. So he's like Mr. hanging out with the yeomanry. And I would assume that not in plain clothes undercover, but just sitting there being a kind of sneering elitist Federalist. Even so, he sits there and drinks, although he says, I'm not a grog drinker, who knows? But he overhears what people say, and he reports it to folks on the national stage. And this kind of thing, Federalists understood that it mattered, right? Hamilton talks about it all the time. Public opinion, it's all about public opinion. But to Hamilton, as he puts it in, I think 1802, the Republicans, the Jeffersonian Republicans, they're really good at appealing to the people's vanity. And in the letter, he writes vanity in all capital letters. Right? The Republicans appeal to their vanity. And that's how he understands public opinion. He acknowledges that it's important, but he interprets it as being, oh, like we need to like appease them and talk to them because they matter in this government. And so, okay, fine. You know, Republicans are better at doing that than we are. We have to be better at doing that. And the Federalists basically don't listen to him. He comes up with, a fascinating and somewhat frightening idea about how to get public opinion to find its way over to the Federalists. He, in that same letter, he says, you know what, we should create Christian constitutional societies. And he describes what that means. He's basically saying, so in the early mid 1790s, there were societies called Democratic Republican societies. And they were pro-French Revolution clubs, and they would make petitions and statements and share them with each other. And they terrified Federalists because what they saw was, you know, hey, remember the revolution with committees of correspondence? What's going on here? So they essentially find ways to shut these Democratic Republican societies down. Washington denounces them in a speech, and they begin to fold after that. So now, years later, that's mostly 1793. Now, years later, 1802, Hamilton says, you know, those societies, they worked really well. We need to have something equivalent. Christian constitutional societies. And it's very clear what he's thinking is the Democratic Republican societies got people all worked up about Jeffersonian Republicans by focusing on the French Revolution as something to be really passionate about, right? We support the French Revolution, the spread of liberty around the globe that we, United States, began, right? All of that emotion behind the French Revolution, and it's part of what makes those societies popular. So Hamilton says, I know what we can do to get people passionate. Christianity, yeah. Christian constitutional societies, that'll get people all worked up, and Christian constitutional. So if we link the Constitution and Christianity in some way, that's going to get people all worked up and with us. And that will be a great way of, again, shaping public opinion while acknowledging that it's important. It's a fascinating letter that is entirely ignored, but it's out there. It's in 1802. I think it might be to Theodore Sedgwick. It would be easy for you to find on Founders Online. If you look up actually Alexander Hamilton and vanity, you'll probably find it. At any rate, all of that sneering on the part of Mr. Van Schack and Hamilton basically saying like, yeah, we just got to find a way to rope them in and then this will be good. It gives you an idea about why the Federalists were not bound for good things as the 1790s ended and the 19th century began. The Federalists understood the importance of public opinion, understood the new government was grounded on it, understood that in one way or another, it had power and they needed to understand where it was and try to shape it. But they were never entirely comfortable with that process. Fundamentally, it's a democratic process. It's a process about speaking and listening. Even if you don't like the process of speaking and listening, engaging in that kind of conversation is democratic. It's about, excuse me, it's a conversation about what's happening, what people think about it, and people with power considering what the public thinks. So it's pretty central to our form of government. Federalists weren't comfortable with it. Jeffersonian Republicans were more comfortable with it. And increasingly, beginning in the 19th century, you see fewer and fewer Federalists are elected to Congress, more and more Republicans are elected to Congress. Federalism, I've talked before, I know, about when parties die, and I talked about the Federalist Party dying and entrenching itself in classrooms, courts, and culture. I remember that from that. I don't know how many years ago that was. But they go by the wayside in part because they're just not linked up or willing to be linked up or even approving of this kind of fundamental democratic ethos about American government. So public opinion matters enormously. The reason I'm mentioning it today, as I began, are my comments today, the yearbook issue and the Clarence Thomas comments, is that particularly, and I have actually a quote or two from the yearbook incident. Excuse me, guys. Let me take a little bit of my coffee here. Okay, I think I'm better. So in the case of the yearbook incident, students spoke up. What changed there? So the school says, no, don't say gay. We can't have this in the yearbook. We're going to put stickers on top of it to block it out or whatever. And the students say, hey, that we like, it's our yearbook. And we, working with a faculty member, but we designed it and we decided what goes in there. And that's our protest. And we want it in there. They spoke up. Apparently, 30 students came to a conversation about what was going on. 30 students, which is a lot of students, and came up, approached the podium and talked about why it was important for what they wanted to be in the yearbook to be in the yearbook. And they talked about LGBTQ issues, and they talked about the right to express what they wanted to express in their yearbook. They talked about things, basically, their rights to express themselves, and the fact that censoring them on something like this that wasn't obscene, or wasn't, there was no reason to block it out except for the Don't Say Gay bill. They really spoke up. And what's wonderful about this is I went digging around in news stories, is that the students did this because they were angry and they felt compelled to stand up and offer their opinion, number one. Number two, their opinion mattered and the school backed down. And number three, really important, the students said they now realize how important their voices are. So one student said, I'm so validated, like I feel so good as a citizen, as a student, as a yearbook member, I feel so good right now. Another one said that there was a big message, something he learned from this. He said, don't be afraid to speak up, because students, they do have a chance to change things. Okay, so think about that, right? That the students express themselves, the school says you can't. The students say our opinions matter and we're going to express them. Their opinion does matter. They get what they want. And then the students say, our opinion matters. Such a vitally important aspect of our system of governance. And I know, on Twitter and in a variety of other places, I'm always insisting that people speak up and express what they're thinking, in a variety of ways, in a variety of different forms, over a variety of different issues. People sometimes will respond and say, well, it doesn't matter. It just doesn't matter. No, it does. It does. And it's not that your individual voice is going to change everything, but it is the case that if public opinion seems to be moving in one or another direction, that matters. And people notice. They might not respond the way you want them to. So, for example, we have Clarence Thomas's statement about, people in the past have just accepted Supreme Court decisions that they don't like. The ultimate irony of that is just that what he's essentially saying is, yeah, because people have just accepted Roe v. Wade, if they didn't like it, it's like, no. But above and beyond my historian brain imploding, he says that because people were in front of justices' houses peacefully protesting, and he didn't like it. And he said, basically just shut up and go home, which is something Hamilton would say, and actually did once. Like, you don't have a right In 1795, you don't have a right to have an opinion on a treaty, go home. That's not popular, and people throw rocks at his head. So what you have here is, people speaking up, people expressing their opinion, and a Chief Justice saying, no, your opinion really doesn't matter here, but it does. And that's part of why I'm doing this episode today, to contradict that. It's not that you're going to speak up, that we are going to speak up, and that somehow a Supreme Court decision will change. It's that if people understand the direction of public sentiment, not just in one place, but if people really stand up and speak up, not by trying to be the loudest, not by trying to be the most violent, but just stepping forward in numbers and expressing what they think. We've seen this also with boycotts, right? Sometimes companies will back down or kind of squirrel their way into a slight change of policy, but we see over and over and over again in recent years, moments when the public steps forward and large numbers, enough numbers step forward and say something that someone takes notice. They might not like the fact that it's happening. They might not agree with what's being said, but in the end, public opinion really does matter. So that's the large message here, is that if people are telling you your opinion doesn't matter, if people are upset that you're expressing it, and again, not with violence, but just expressing your opinion. So for example, Susan Collins, someone wrote apparently on the sidewalk in front of her house, Susie, please, Mainers want the Women's Health Protection Act. Vote yes, clean up your mess. That's what it said on the sidewalk. And she called the police. Now, on the one hand, I understand that because everything feels threatening right now. On the other hand, it's a chalk message saying, we want this act. It's a reminder of the fact that that kind of exchange should be happening all the time, right? History matters, democracy matters. Someone wrote that because that was what they assumed to be the best way to reach Susan Collins. Remember years ago when various members of Congress were they no longer were having town hall meetings. They just were no longer being available to the public at all. That alarmed me for the same reason as what I'm talking about now, because that feels like a pretty fundamental violation of not just what the government should be doing, but what representatives should be doing. In their case, if your constituents don't like something, you're supposed to think about that, grapple with it, engage with them. Like, that's called representation. So at any rate, the end message here is that speaking up matters, like those wonderful high school students said about their yearbook. It matters not just because it makes noise, but because it's a fundamental part about how our government works. It's an expression of democracy. And if enough people engage in those kinds of conversations, they're heard, or if the right people engage in it in a particularly striking way. And, almost anything you talk about nowadays, there's an extreme version of what you say that people can say, oh yeah, well, what do you call these people who are saying this thing in this horrible way? There are all kinds of ways in which we can say, that doesn't feel civil, that doesn't feel safe. That's a different conversation. What I'm saying in this conversation is public opinion matters. It has from the beginning. People who are nervous about the expression of public opinion are essentially nervous about aspects of democracy. And we need to remember that. And we need to remember that our voices matter. And we need to use them. Sounds like a pretty simple message. But I see the mug chiming in here. Sounds like a pretty simple message, but it's a really important message. It would be hard to exaggerate the degree to which public opinion is absolutely at the heart of our form of government. Okay, this will not surprise you, this mug, because it's the perfect mug for today. Thank you for engaging in democracy every Friday morning, because we are engaging in democracy by having these conversations. Like, I may be pontificating on what I think, but then you guys are commenting and asking questions and talking with each other and talking with me, and that matters. And it would be easy to dismiss what's going on here and say, like a small group of people, so what? It matters. It matters. It matters in part because you go away informed, often have different conversations. It matters because we can do this and we can be critical. It matters in so many ways. So this is a reminder about how much. There it is. Okay. We didn't even plan this. So no, anyway. Okay. So that is today's mug. Okay.
I feel so much better. This happens every Friday. Like, no matter what's going on in the world, I feel better when I come here. You sort of have a way of making us all feel like it's not, like it's going to be okay.
Well,
And history will correct it.
that's good. It's good. I pause only because I'm like, I hope it will all be okay, but contingency.
Yeah, I know, right?
I don't know. But what I want to do is encourage people to not assume it's over. It's over when you think it's over, and it's not over. So at any rate.
So people are asking about the background. You have to figure it out, and hopefully it's not backwards this week.
No, it's forward.
So it's sort of like when you're behind somebody in a car and you're trying to figure out what their personalized license plate means. This one shouldn't be too hard. But anyway, we have some great questions. I threw something in the chat, Joanne. You probably didn't see it because you were talking, but when you were talking about the students with the yearbook and sticking up for what they believed in, when I was a little kid, our high school newspaper that my brother was the editor at the time, a young lady wrote an article about birth control. And this is in the 70s. And the school tried to say that it was inappropriate and they couldn't print it. And the kids in protest blacked out the article. So it was just the headline, but it covered the article with a black box, and they printed it anyway. And the principal got mad and tried to suspend them all. Anyway, it went to all the way to the Supreme Court. Tom, I think, already threw the link in there. It's Gambino versus Fairfax County School Board. My brother was halfway through William and Mary before the case got decided, but it's considered right up there with the Tinker case as a landmark.
They're our future. Kids are our future. And that's part of what I thought about today with the yearbook.
Absolutely. Kids get it. And I just, they're my hope.
So throw some questions at me.
Yeah. All right. So we've got Dale was our first question. How did the Society of the Cincinnati or the Masons fit into these, society public opinion efforts?
Oh, interesting. Okay, so in both cases, so when Tocqueville comes to the United States and meanders around, one of the things he says is, societies and clubs. The United States is all about these societies and clubs, and they're so spread out over such a big distance that it's actually these societies and clubs that hold everything together. They bring people together. They come together for things that they believe in or that they like. In one way or another, they matter. And there's a section in Democracy in America in which he talks about this. But the flip side of that, and that's true of the Society of the Cincinnati and the Masons, those are societies that are renowned for being exclusive. So the Society of the Cincinnati is created in the wake of the American Revolution, and it's basically a society that officers of the revolution and their offspring can be members of only. So it's hereditary sounding, and it's only for officers. And there's a big uproar about they're starting an American aristocracy. A lot of talk against it, pamphlets about it. It becomes a big issue because it feels exclusive. I mean, Democratic Republican societies, they might have very strong views, but it's, in a official kind of a way, they didn't say anyone whose name begins with P cannot come in this room. So the Society of the Cincinnati feels exclusive and aristocratic, and there's an uproar. The Masons, same thing, right? It's you have to be a member. There are ceremonies involved with membership. There's secret handshakes and things that, Masons have that they understand. And Americans are always, and this is particularly true for the Masons, always suspect about anything that suggests people are loyal to a government above their own. So in the case of the Masons, it seems like there's some other superstructure people are loyal to above and beyond the government. Catholics, like people are loyal to the Pope, not loyal to American government. We still do this when we talk about immigrants of various sorts, and we've done it over time, right? Hey, this person, they're loyal to whatever country and not loyal to this country. Or Jews who are accused of being loyal to Israel more than they are to the United States. I mean, come on. So, but at any rate, that's a constant sort of accusation. So there are some societies, it's not like America's like, yay, people collecting together, it's all good. They do it because it matters, right? They do it because they come together in groups to communicate, to work towards goals that they agree on. But it's not all blue skies, right? There, and I don't think the expression of public opinion and the impact of public opinion, like anything else in democracy, can always be blue skies. It can't, right? Democracy ultimately is about conflict. It's about conflicting voices. It's about debate and compromise. And compromise is a nice sunny word, but debate and compromise does not have to be sunny in any way. So democracy is about people banging up against each other and coming to decisions that people can agree on in one way or another, or that some people can't enforce what they want because they don't have the numbers. But that's what democracy is. And so sometimes, that's going to be problematic. Sometimes that's going to be too problematic, and that's a different conversation. But there's a reason why a democratic government that values public opinion and wants an engaged public can veer towards extremes. And that's some of what the founding generation talked about, right? They were afraid of a pure democracy, but they were nervous about, particularly the Federalists, democracy, because it was about passions, right? How do you tame democracy? Maybe you can't, and a pure democracy is going to go down in flames. So there are all kinds of complications to this, and different ways of approaching it. But regardless of the complications, the fact of the matter is public opinion is at the center of democratic governance. So it's at the center of our process of government.
So were the early fraternities and sororities at colleges, would that be sort of like training wheels for these societies? I never thought of that. Like, how would that be part of that? You said that it had to be their children or something.
Right.
So
I don't know if I would say they were training wheels. They were really important. I've had students write about some of these clubs and things at Yale for their senior essays or research papers for my class, and they were competitive, and some of them were exclusive, so they had some of the same issues. But I don't know if I'd say they were training wheels, because I think actually, in a sense, Tocqueville was right, which is that Americans do that, right? I mean, if you are spread out over a vast distance, and that was one of the distinctive things about the United States, when people said, yay, it's a small r Republican form of government. And some people said, you can't do that in that big a distance. It doesn't work. Tocqueville's like, well, I guess you can. And this is one of the ways you can, right? People come together and make groups that do things that would be easier to do if you were geographically smaller. So I don't know if I'd say training wheels, but it's the same impulse, and some of them were exclusive, and there were controversies.
Yeah, because I know you were just at UVA, and I was just thinking all those secret societies, they have the letter Z written, all over.
No, and someone just said Skull and Bones at Yale. Yeah, no, for sure. And there's a case, actually, if you're talking about secret societies, student secret societies, that's actually more along the lines of like the Masons, right? Where people assume there's like a secret chain of power, and then once you get in, you're connected to the chain of power, and we don't know what's going on there, but we're not sure we like it, but it's been there forever, and can we do anything about it? So there are some college secret societies that touch on other aspects of what we're talking about here, that you're right, that are some of the fears are bound up with fears that people have about, like, the Masons or Society of Cincinnati.
Now I'm going to go down that rabbit hole after we hang up this afternoon. So here's one from Cece. It says, can Joanne maybe think of what comes up for her about the most important changes in American laws or rights due to opinion? Like, she wants a top 5 list. I don't know if we can ask you up to put you on the spot for a whole top 5, but she says particularly the period that you've been discussing, this 19th century, like maybe not 5, but are there any that you come to mind?
I mean, I can't name specifics, but I can talk about directions being determined based on where the public is. And sometimes it's elections that show that. So for example, if you look at the late 18th century, when the Federalists, they're in power for, the first decade of government. And with the Alien and Sedition Acts, they're trying, on the one hand, they say they're trying to protect national security. On the other hand, they're trying to shut down Republican opposition from attacking the government. And what you see in the presidential election of 1800 is it's not the deciding factor in that election, Alien and Sedition Acts, but it sure doesn't help. So the public registers pretty strongly what they want and don't want, and they react against that kind of measure. So, that it feels kind of fundamental to say, elections are registers of public opinion, but they are, which is part of why they're so central to our system of government. And really, if they're fouled up in some way, it's a big problem. But at any rate, so, that's one example of this. I would say some of what was going on in the 1960s in the civil rights case, where people were really stepping forward and showing their passion and commitment to this cause, even though that roused opposition, that level of passion and that degree of righteousness and the ways in which some people saw and understood what was happening, I think that mattered. Can I say that this event happened and it caused this thing to change? No, probably a scholar of the 1960s could, but what I can say is that's a moment when public opinion was strong, and it's a technology moment, because part of why the public was responding was they were seeing things on TV. They were seeing, fire hoses and dogs on TV being set against civil rights protesters. And that mattered a lot, right? I've talked about this before, that technology, actually this relates to what I said today. So democracy in a general way is about a conversation between power holders, political power holders, and the people who gave them that power. And any form of technology that changes that conversation changes democracy. So television is an example of that, right? Things are going along. It's a period where there's a lot of upset. Insert television into the middle of that, and suddenly Americans are seeing things they didn't see before. They may have had a vague sense that they were happening, but if you're watching it on your TV in your living room, that matters a lot. And I've talked before, I know, about how the telegraph does something similar, the radio did something similar, the burst of the printing of presses becoming mechanized and being able to come out faster and being spread out more broadly, again and again and again. Technology changes the conversation of democracy because it enables people to see things or understand things that they didn't before, and opens up, potentially, if people take that advantage of it, a conversation. Suddenly, the public is engaged in a way that might not have been the case if people were sort of independently hearing, wisps of things. It matters. So technology matters a lot, and it can create or take apart communities, but it's powerful. And the 1960s, I'd say, is another example of public opinion definitely registering.
Yeah, so people are talking about the war protest in Vietnam. So it makes me think, is Twitter the new television, right? Like that's where we're battling it out.
No, it is. I mean, I've talked about this at lectures before, that the telegraph, not to put it prettily, but the telegraph freaks people out, because suddenly people in Washington and the rest of the country, among other things, instant access. Something happens in Washington, the people who used to have spin control don't have spin control, and it gets to the nation instantly. And that freaks people out because suddenly the conversation has changed. The conversation of democratic governance has changed. Same thing is true with TV. And I absolutely think that social media more generally, but particularly Twitter, because we just had a president who tweeted, social media and Twitter absolutely are changing the nature of our politics in ways that we even don't necessarily know yet. We're in the middle of it. So kind of in the same way that, the telegraph is becoming more and more used, and people are, exactly. Actually, Emily says, "What hath God wrought?" That book, I have it right behind me here. Someone give me the name of the author, because I'm so bad.
It says Morse.
No, that's not the author. It's anyway, someone will give it to me. But what hath God wrought is a book, and it's Morse who did say that with the telegraph. Daniel Walker Howe, thank you very much. So this book by Daniel Walker Howe, What Hath God Wrought, that actually is a tale, a history of the 19th century, but the central thread is precisely what I'm talking about here, which is how technology changes the nation and changes democracy. And that's because it changes community and conversation. And that's where the power is. That's what people want to shape or shut down. If someone is shutting down a civil conversation, that is usually not a good thing. I said to Heather yesterday that I'm always trying so hard to be diplomatic, which is not always good. And that in one case, I was doing some BBC News show, and it was me and someone from the Trump administration going up against each other. And I was saying that a president's words matter more than other people's words. And the Trump administration person was saying, no, like words don't matter. And I was like, words don't matter. And I said something like, words matter, they matter a lot. And to say that they don't, to say that a president's words don't matter more than other people's words. And I paused and I said something like, is less than optimal. I was trying so hard not to be like, Gah! On TV, but is less than optimal was probably not where I should have gone. But at any rate, the larger point that we're talking about here in a variety of different ways, even the technology part of what we're talking about here, it has to do with conversation and power and the public and people who have power.
Yeah.
Okay,
so the next question is from Miranda, and she says she's getting very disillusioned because everything in public opinion seems to be an either or, right? And she's wondering, with everything going on with Roe v. Wade decision, how can we combat this? This divisiveness, this it's got to be my way or your way, winners, losers. She's wondering your thoughts on that.
I have to say, he just said newbie doobie 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 over there. It's quiet.
Strong opinions about this.
Very strong opinions about this. So I would say a few things. I would say it's important to remember that what we see, particularly on social media, does not necessarily reflect public opinion. It reflects the opinions of the people who are weighing in loudest and most frequently on social media, and thus some of these people are hired to weigh in loudly and frequently, bots and everything else going on. So I would say, on the one hand, I, like everyone else, I go on Twitter and spend too much time on Twitter, but I can teach on Twitter and it teaches me. I go on Twitter and I see like extreme opinion, and this is Miranda who asked the question.
Yes.
Like Miranda, I'm like, it's one or another. There's nothing in between. I think it's important to realize that that's social media, right? You don't get bounced, pinged all over the place for saying, I think the truth is somewhere in the middle. Mm-hmm. Sometimes maybe you do, but it's the people who are like, saying less than optimal is not going to get me a lot of likes on Twitter. But so part of the answer to the question is, don't get disillusioned at the appearance of things. Related to that, we hear again and again that, and we're seeing a lot of it, or at least I've seen a lot of polls drifting by in the last week that say, most Americans aren't really excited about the idea of banned books. Most Americans, generally speaking, want the right to have an abortion, maybe with restrictions, but they want the right to have an abortion. Most Americans ... And, I assume that is true. I am not a poll maker, but the fact of the matter that these polls are saying Americans writ large do not necessarily agree with book banning. You could go on Twitter and see people banning books and people screaming about it, but there's a majority of people who are not speaking up and are not in the conversation, but whose views matter enormously. Of course, that gets us to elections, and that's a whole different conversation. But in a functioning democratic government, an election can thus represent the will of the majority, and that will can then be put into action by putting people in office who reflect it. It's the most obvious thing in the world for me to say that that's how democratic governance works, and that we are at a moment when we need to be thinking about that a lot. But I said at the beginning, actually, I do want to make the point. I said I'm talking about public opinion, but in the course of talking about this, I've talked about protests, I've talked about the press, I've talked about technology. It's all kind of bound up together in there. Protest is a way of expressing public opinion. It is, which is why the nature of a protest, the tone of a protest, the message of a protest really matters. If you are holding signs and asserting something, even if it's unpopular, you're expressing your opinion, and that's something that we value enough that in essence is constitutional. This right to peaceably assemble, or the right to petition your government, it's part of our rights as American citizens. But there are all kinds of ways in which that can be stretched, and has been stretched in the past, that has caused people, do you give the Ku Klux Klan that kind of power? Well, apparently you kind of have to. But what does that mean? What does it mean? When do you draw a line or not draw a line? And right now we have a lot of people pushing the envelope, I guess I shall say. And, again, I know I have my different brains. Historian brain looks at the current moment and is fascinated, because we are in the middle of so much contingency, change, and so many unknowns, and there's such a possibility for dramatic change, for better and worse, that there's a good reason we all feel destabilized. There's a good reason why we feel anxious. There's a good reason why we get worked up about things, because we're living in a moment when that's true to an extreme degree. Historically speaking, those are fascinating moments to look at and study and understand. Personally speaking, I'd be okay with a time when I could just kind of assume the government functions and, go about my business. That's not where we are. But, it's precisely because we're in this kind of moment that public opinion matters so much, including our humble conversations on Friday mornings.
Exactly. Okay, Anne has a question. It says, in terms of the Clarence Thomas comment, could a discussion of the difference between respect, which is earned, or deference, which is based on accepted hierarchical caste system, so to speak, what is due to one's better? She's saying a system of American polity should be found abhorrent. Ooh, that's a mouthful, Anne. I think she's asking like the difference between respect and deference in regard to Clarence Thomas' comment.
Well, and respect and deference are not the same thing, right? So a great example of that is there's an anecdote about the period right after the revolution. I'm going to get his name wrong because it's so many names. George Roberts Twelves Hughes, I think is his name. I'll get it correct. It's wonderful. And there's a book called The Shoemaker and the Tea Party that talks about this man who took part in all of these events and then lived long enough to write about them. But one of the things he talks about, and it's a good teaching book, I will say, one of the things he talks about is how before the revolution, he made a pair of shoes for John Hancock, and he went to the back door as he should as a shoemaker and with the shoes, and John Hancock liked the shoes so much he ushered Hughes into his, a living area of some kind, and like wanted to have a drink with him. And Hughes is like, I'd never done that before, and I didn't know what to do. And how do you make a toast this way with this kind of person? And I don't know. And all he wanted was to leave. He was just like, I don't know how to deal with this person. This is not the way my life normally is. And then after the revolution, he tells a story about being on the street and someone says something, like and I can't remember if he's like in the way on the sidewalk or something. Some elite fellow says, you should show deference to people like me. And Hughes basically says, I'm your equal. Like, I'm your equal. I don't disrespect you, but I don't, deference suggests hierarchy. Respect can mean equality. So respect is important. Deference is more complicated, because if you are talking about government, you are talking about hierarchy, even just within the government. Right. And that kind of like in the army, right? That matters, the heads of things but that said, respect matters too. I'm not going to pontificate, and we're actually almost out of time, on people protesting in front of Supreme Court justices' houses. As I understand it, and I haven't looked into it, they're civil, they're protesting, I guess, with signs, and I don't know what, if they're chanting something or what, I don't know. So that's an issue, that can be debated, but simply saying that should never happen is too simple, right? There needs to be, you can't, in these kinds of matters that concern the fundamentals of democracy, say, nope, that can't be, or yes, this is always the case, because nothing is that easy when you're talking about the fundamentals of how a democracy runs, the dynamics of democracy. They are not simple.
Yeah, as a follow-up, Kathleen is asking, she says, I hear more people saying that the US is not a democracy, it's a constitutional republic. Can you please clarify the differences and purposes of that distinction at this moment in history?
Yes. So here's the thing. A republic is a democratic form of government. So we are a democratic republic. Not all republics are democratic. We are a democratic form of government. We are a republic in structure. There are some people who very much don't want to say that, they want to say, like, we are not a democracy, to sort of make that word and that idea go away. The founders understood democracy to mean governance by the all, not representative. And to them, that was insane, right? So the founders spoke all the time against democracy, but what they were talking about is not what we assume democracy is today. So you can't go back and see, even Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, democracy is the problem. They're not using our modern word. They're using this word in a totally different way. It means a totally different thing. So I think some people pull that and are like, yeah, see, the founder said. Yeah, no, that's not what they were saying or intending. So we are a democratic form of governance. It is, we have a democratic mode of governing. And in structure, we are a republic. We're a democratic republic. We have a constitution. The constitution creates the republic, and it's democratic in the way it operates. So, you can't say, you can say it's not a pure democracy, but it sure as heck is democratic. So I hate, I'll say all the time, democracy doesn't work this way. And people will say, we're not a democracy. Like, I'm talking about a mode of governance here, folks. Democracy and how it works. And that conversation we can have. We can bypass this endless conversation about if we're a republic or a democracy. Like I said, it's complicated in part because people cherry pick quotes from the founders to make them say what they want them to say. But regardless, democracy is the foundation of our system. Democratic governance, democracy. It is, whatever you want to call us, we are supposed to be a democratic mode of governance. That's what's supposed to be governing us. That is a fine place to end, since we're now 3 minutes over.
If you've got more questions, as always, you can never fit them all.
This is actually really good question. This was a really good conversation, and I had really strong coffee, so I'm like jazzed.
Yeah, and this was a good topic. I mean, people are fired up in the chat.
It was, and I feel very strongly about it. Obviously, I've written about it. However, let me now say that we are now coming to the close of the recorded version of History Matters and So Does Coffee. We are now going to segue into the after party. What that means is that we will stop recording so the conversation can be a little freer, a little more free flowing, and we'll be able to engage with each other and talk about whatever we want to talk about after this point. If you are beaming in online, not through Facebook, but if you came in through the NCHE link, already people are saying poof. They are. Just stay where you are and poof, you will be in the after party. You don't have to move anywhere or go anywhere. If you're on Facebook, you need to leave Facebook and enter the after party through the link ncheteach.org/conversations. So with that, I will say thank you as always for engaging in democracy this Friday morning, as we always do. It's important. T-shirt. It's important. It really is. I believe that, obviously, or I wouldn't have been doing this for 2 years.
We wouldn't be tuning in for 2 years.
And that's right. It wouldn't be tuning in. So thank you very much for being here and engaging in this conversation. And I will see you next week with a topic that I don't know what it'll be yet, but I'll come up with one. And in the meantime, have a good week, be safe, and see you guys soon. Those who want to stick for the after party, Annie and I are here.
We're here with coffee.
But we need to stop recording.
Yeah, we need John to